Prophecy Decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
They told us blood runs thicker than water, but the records scream betrayal. Family bonds promise protection, yet silver speaks louder. One dream on coat, one moment in the dust. This shattered everything. Which brothers bartered their own flesh for profit. Stay with this, because the scandal that follows carved a new destiny for nations. And here's tonight's exclusive promise. The ancient stones will testify, and the silence ends now. Picture a horizon where camel bells drift like echoes from another world. The desert air tastes of dust and possibility. A torn piece of cloth flutters against a thorn bush, its colors bleeding in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, water reflects the last light of day. Clay tablets dry in the sun, recording transactions that history would remember. This is Canaan, where God's chosen people learned that covenant does not guarantee character. Where a family's darkest hour became a nation's brightest hope. Where brothers looked into each other's eyes and chose silver over souls. The boy's name was Joseph. 17 years of breath and dream and dangerous honesty. He walked with the confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt his welcome. His coat caught light like a prayer made visible, every thread singing of favor, every color announcing his father's heart. Jacob had loved before, but Joseph felt different. The son of Rachel, born of passion rather than duty. The child who carried conversations like treasures and spoke visions like they were everyday news. He wore his father's affection like armor, never knowing it made him a target. This coat was not just cloth. It was a declaration written in dye and thread. Every stitch proclaimed this one matters more. In a world where inheritance determined destiny, where a father's blessing could lift a man to greatness or leave him scrambling for scraps, this coat was a verdict. The other brothers saw it and tasted ash. They had worked while Joseph reported. They had sweated in fields while Joseph sat by fires. They had earned coluses while Joseph earned smiles. The coat made visible what they had always feared: they were expendable. But it was the dreams that turned resentment into rage. Sheaves of grain bowing down in golden fields. Stars and moon and sun performing reverence like courtiers before a throne. Joseph told these visions with the breathless wonder of someone who had touched the divine, never hearing how his words landed on other ears. Stars and moon and sun performing reverence like courtiers before a throne. He thought his brothers would marvel at the mystery. Instead, they marveled at his audacity. Dreams of dominion from lips barely old enough to speak wisdom. Visions of power from hands that had never held a sword. The brothers listened and felt something dark take root. Here's what they never mention when they reduced this story to children's lessons about jealousy. This was not playground rivalry. This was survival anxiety in a world where position meant everything. These were men who understood that resources were finite, that a father's favor was currency, that being second best could mean being second class for life. The brothers had watched Jacob love Rachel more than Leah, had seen how that preference poisoned every meal, every conversation, every glance. Now they watched that same inequality repeat in the next generation, and the pattern felt like prophecy they could not escape. The summons came like lightning across clear sky. "Go check on your brothers in Dothan," Jacob said. "Take this grain, this kindness, these supplies." Joseph set out with the eager steps of someone who expected warm greetings and shared laughter. The brothers saw him first, a distant figure approaching through heat waves, that coat blazing like a beacon. Someone laughed, but the sound had edges. Someone spat. Someone said the words that would echo through centuries. Here comes the dreamer. Let us kill him and throw him into a pit. Then we will see what becomes of his dreams. The plan was simple and terrible. Murder in the wilderness leaves no witnesses. Wild animals would explain the blood. A father's grief would bury the questions. They would return home with practiced sorrow and shared story, their secrets safe in the grave. But conscience is a stubborn thing, even in corrupted men. Reuben spoke first, the eldest, the one who should have led but rarely did. His voice cracked the spell. Do not shed blood. Throw him into the pit, but do not lay hands on him. He planned to return later, to pull the boy out under cover of darkness, to send him home with warnings to keep his dreams to himself. It was half courage, the kind that satisfies guilt without risking much. Joseph reached them with trust still bright in his eyes. The attack was sudden, vicious, personal. Hands tore at the coat until threads scattered like confetti. The garment that had announced his worth became a rag in their fists. They pushed him toward a cistern cut deep into limestone, one of many that dotted the landscape, where water was more precious than gold. He fell into darkness, his cries echoing off stone walls, his pleas bouncing back as mockery. Above him, his brothers sat down to eat bread, as if nothing had changed, as if a life had not just been suspended over an abyss. The sound of commerce saved and damned him at once. A caravan crested the hill, bells announcing profit, voices calling in the ancient language of trade. These were Ishmaelites, descendants of Abraham's other son, carrying spices and dreams toward Egypt's markets. Judah looked at the pit, then at the approaching merchants, and calculated. What profit is there in killing our brother and concealing his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh. The logic was poisonous and perfect. Murder stained the hands, but commerce cleaned them. Death left bodies, but slavery left distance. This way, they could have their revenge and their righteousness too. 20 pieces of silver changed hands. Not much by modern standards, but enough to buy a life in that economy. Enough to purchase distance from conscience. Enough to transform a brother into merchandise. The rope dropped into the pit one last time. Joseph rose toward light he thought meant rescue, only to find chains instead. The Ishmaelites bound him with professional efficiency, the casual competence of men who trafficked in human flesh. His cries for help became part of the desert's soundtrack, one more voice lost in the wind. The caravan moved on, carrying its cargo toward the Nile, toward a future none of them could imagine. The cover-up required theater worthy of professional mourners. A goat bled into a bowl while hands worked the stain into Joseph's coat, pressing crimson into every thread until the fabric looked like evidence of violence. Claws could have made these tears. Teeth could have drawn this blood. The story wrote itself in gore and imagination. They carried the ruined coat to Jacob like priests bearing an offering to judgment. Is this your son's coat? Recognition struck faster than grief. Joseph's coat. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph is torn to pieces. The old man's cry split the air like fabric. He tore his clothes with the same violence that had torn his heart. Sackcloth replaced silk. Ashes replaced ointment. His children gathered around him, his sons and daughters offering comfort they had poisoned, speaking soothing words they had rendered meaningless. He refused their consolation. How could they comfort him when they were the wound? I will go down to Sheol mourning for my son, he declared, choosing grief as his companion for whatever years remained. I will go down to Sheol mourning for my son. The house settled into the rhythm of perpetual sorrow, and silence became the brothers' closest ally. But guilt is a living thing. It grows in darkness, feeds on secrets, multiplies in quiet moments. The brothers went about their lives, marrying wives, fathering children, tending flocks, making the ordinary motions that convince the world everything is normal. But normal became a performance. Reuben stared at horizons too long, searching for a caravan that would never return. Simeon picked fights over small things, his anger seeking any target except the true one. Levi sharpened his blade obsessively, as if keeping steel keen could somehow cut away the past. Judah spoke less and listened more, as if silence could somehow balance the lies. They lived with their secret the way men live with chronic pain, adjusting their movements to accommodate the edge, never quite finding comfort. Meanwhile, Joseph's road led toward wonders and horrors. Egypt opened before him like a door to another universe. Cities rose like man-made mountains. The Nile flowed with the patience of eternity, feeding fields that stretched beyond sight. Markets exploded with colors, sounds, smells that had no names in his shepherd's vocabulary. He was sold again because property has no say in its ownership. This time he landed in the house of Potiphar, a captain in Pharaoh's guard, a man who valued efficiency more than sentiment, results more than pedigree. Joseph learned Egypt's language with the desperate focus of someone whose survival depended on communication. He mastered the household's rhythms, memorized its needs, anticipated its problems before they ripened into crisis. His competence became his currency. Potiphar noticed. Promotion followed performance. Authority accumulated in foreign hands because ability recognizes no nationality. Joseph rose from slave to steward, from property to manager, from victim to administrator. The house prospered under his touch. Gold accumulated. Grain filled warehouses. Order replaced chaos. Joseph discovered that faithfulness, even in exile, bears fruit. But success in a foreign house could not erase the bruise on his soul. He still woke sometimes with the taste of dust in his mouth, still dreamed of a pit whose walls pressed closer in memory than they had in reality. He carried his family's betrayal like a scar that had healed badly, tender to the touch, always ready to remind him how quickly love could turn to violence. Yet he chose faithfulness anyway, service anyway, excellence anyway. Not because the wound had healed, but because character is not determined by what happens to us, but by what we choose to do afterward. Then temptation arrived wearing a familiar face. Potiphar's wife noticed the young Hebrew whose competence had elevated him, whose bearing suggested nobility despite his status. Her attention became pursuit, her interest became demand, her words became snares. "Lie with me," she said, and the invitation carried all the weight of her position, all the threat of her displeasure. Joseph fled, but flight left evidence. His garment remained in her hand, while his body escaped her reach. False accusation followed rejected seduction. The same lips that had whispered promises now screamed charges. Joseph learned that integrity sometimes leads to prison, that doing right sometimes results in doing time. The dungeon was stone and shadow, iron and isolation. But character proved portable. Joseph carried his gifts into captivity and found ways to serve even behind bars. The keeper of the prison noticed. Responsibility migrated toward reliability. Even in chains, Joseph administered, organized, improved. Fellow prisoners came to respect the foreign slave who somehow maintained dignity in degradation. When dreams visited other men's sleep, they brought their visions to the Hebrew, who seemed to understand the language heaven spoke in symbols. A baker and a cupbearer shared their nighttime theater, and Joseph interpreted their futures with accuracy that would be remembered when memory mattered most. Years passed like water through stone, slow and relentless. Joseph's beard grew gray in places. His hands developed the calluses of a man who worked despite his circumstances. He learned to live without expecting rescue, to serve without demanding recognition, to hope without scheduling fulfillment. Then Pharaoh dreamed, and the dreams came with such force that the entire palace woke sweating. Cows emerged from the Nile, fat and sleek, only to be devoured by creatures so thin their bones showed through skin. Ears of grain, plump with promise, were consumed by stalks withered beyond recognition. The royal advisors stammered explanations that explained nothing. Magic failed. Wisdom crumbled. Then the cupbearer remembered a Hebrew in prison who had once spoken futures into fulfillment. Joseph stood before power with the calm of a man who had learned to distinguish between what he could control and what he could only endure. Pharaoh described his dreams while courtiers held their breath. Joseph listened with the attention of someone translating languages, decoding symbols, reading messages written in the grammar of divine communication. "The dreams are one," he said. "The dreams are one," he said. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of abundance will be followed by 7 years of famine, so severe it will consume the memory of plenty. Store grain during the fat years. Distribute it during the lean years. Choose a man who can manage both prosperity and crisis, someone who understands that today's surplus is tomorrow's salvation. Pharaoh heard truth ring like a bell cast from pure metal. The interpretation carried the weight of revelation, the authority of someone who spoke for powers higher than earthly thrones. The recommendation was practical, the credentials were proven, the candidate was standing before him. Joseph walked from prison to palace in a single conversation. The signet ring that had sealed his condemnation now sealed his commission. The royal chariot that had carried him to judgment now carried him to authority. Egypt bowed to the Hebrew who had learned to bow to providence. The next 14 years validated the vision. Grain mountains rose behind warehouse walls. Administrative systems hummed with efficiency. Abundance was harvested, not just consumed, stored, not just celebrated. When the sky forgot how to rain and the river forgot how to flood, when the earth cracked like broken pottery and desperation drove men to travel hundreds of miles for handfuls of grain, Egypt was ready. Joseph's preparation became the world's salvation. Caravans arrived from every direction, carrying silver and stories, desperation and gratitude. Among those travelers, destiny walked on familiar feet. Joseph recognized them instantly. 20 years had changed their faces, but not their fundamental shapes, had grayed their beards but not erased their identities. They did not recognize him because transformation through power and pain had rendered him unrecognizable, because the boy they had sold had become a man they could not imagine. The temptation for immediate revenge must have been overwhelming. Justice lived within his reach. With a word, he could have them imprisoned. With a gesture, he could have them executed. With a whisper, he could have visited upon them every horror they had visited upon him, multiplied by royal authority. Instead, he tested them, not from cruelty, but from wisdom. Forgiveness without truth is merely sentiment. Mercy without repentance is merely weakness. He needed to know what kind of men they had become, whether 20 years had taught them anything about the weight of their choices. He accused them of being spies, pressing them to reveal their family structure. They spoke of their father, still alive, still grieving, still carrying the wound they had inflicted 2 decades before. They mentioned Benjamin, the youngest, kept at home because the previous youngest had been lost to wild beasts. The lie tasted fresh in their mouths, as familiar as a prayer learned in childhood. Joseph demanded proof. "Bring your youngest brother," he commanded. "One of you will remain here while the others return. Choose who stays and who carries grain back to your starving family." Simeon was bound before their eyes, led away while his brothers watched, helpless to prevent another loss, another failure to protect. They returned to Canaan with sacks heavy with grain and hearts heavier with dread. Hidden in their sacks was the silver they had brought to purchase food, mysteriously returned, adding the weight of apparent theft to their burden of ancient guilt. Jacob heard their report and felt the earth shift beneath his feet. "Everything is against me," he cried. "Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." The request was impossible, the choice unbearable. Benjamin was Rachel's other son, the living reminder of the wife he had loved best, the child who had replaced Joseph in the architecture of his affection. To risk Benjamin was everything that remained of his reason for drawing breath. Hunger, however, is a patient counselor. It waits while pride postures and grief staggers, but eventually it demands audience. The grain ran out. Bellies began to echo with emptiness. Famine pressed against the door with the persistence of unwelcome truth. Judah stepped forward, no longer the young man who had calculated profit from a brother's misery. 20 years of living with consequences had taught him the weight of words, the cost of choices, the price of broken trust. "Send the boy with me," he said. "I will be surety for him." "Send the boy with me, I will be surety for him. If I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame all my life." No clever bargains, no theatrical promises, no attempts to leverage other lives against his failure. Just shoulders willing to bear whatever weight might fall. Just a man offering himself as collateral against catastrophe. They returned to Egypt, this time with Benjamin in their company, with gifts in their hands, with double silver in their purses, with hearts that beat against ribs like birds against cages. Joseph saw his full brother for the first time in 2 decades and barely maintained composure. The boy had become a man, but the eyes were familiar, the gestures echoed across years. He prepared a feast, seated them according to birth order in a demonstration of knowledge that should have been impossible, sent portions from his table with Benjamin receiving 5 times more than the others. They ate and drank and wondered at the strangeness of their situation, never suspecting they were dining with ghosts made flesh. The final test required precision and profound risk. Joseph's silver cup found its way into Benjamin's sack, through the sleight of hand that authority makes possible. The brothers departed with the dawn, only to be pursued by accusation, only to watch in horror as evidence of theft emerged from the luggage of the one they were sworn to protect. The penalty was bondage. The guilty party would remain as slave while the innocent departed. The moment crystallized into perfect choice: you abandon Benjamin and save themselves, or stay and share his fate. The old pattern beckoned. The familiar escape route gleamed. They could go home with a story of tragic circumstance, could explain to Jacob that Benjamin had been caught, condemned, lost to Egyptian justice, just as Joseph had been lost to wilderness violence. Instead, Judah stepped into the breach with words that had been 20 years in the making. He told the truth. Not the sanitized version, not the comfortable fiction they had maintained, but the actual history of their house. He spoke of a father whose life was bound up in the life of his youngest son, whose joy had died with one boy, and whose survival depended on another. He spoke of the promise he had made, the surety he had become, the guarantee he had signed with his own future. He offered himself. "Take me instead," he said. "Let the boy return to his father. Take me instead, let the boy return to his father. Let the guilt fall where it belongs, on the one who is willing to carry it." Joseph could not maintain the performance any longer. He dismissed the Egyptian attendants with gestures that barely concealed the emotion building behind his eyes. When the room was empty of strangers, when only brothers remained in the presence of brothers, he wept with the force of 20 years of suppressed grief. The sound echoed off palace walls, a cry that contained both anguish and relief, both accusation and absolution. When the storm passed, he spoke words that had waited decades for their moment. "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? I'm Hosea. Is my father still alive?" The revelation struck like lightning in clear sky. The brothers stood frozen, suspended between disbelief and terror, between joy and judgment. The boy they had sold stood before them clothed in authority, capable of vengeance beyond their worst nightmares. He could crush them with a word, destroy them with a gesture, visit upon them every humiliation they had visited upon him. Instead, he stepped closer and spoke with the voice of someone who had learned to distinguish between justice and revenge, between truth and cruelty. "Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here," he said, "because God sent me before you to preserve life. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me before you to preserve life. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." The embrace that followed contained multitudes. 20 years of separation collapsed into a moment of reunion. Grief transformed into gratitude. Loss revealed itself as providence. The brothers who had once stripped Joseph's coat now clothed themselves in his forgiveness. The cistern that had nearly become his grave became the foundation of his rise. The silver that had purchased his slavery had purchased their salvation. Not because the evil had been necessary, but because grace had been sufficient. Not because the betrayal had been justified, but because redemption had been possible. Right now, as we speak, this story repeats itself in boardrooms and living rooms, in political chambers and family kitchens. Siblings compete for attention that feels scarce. Parents play favorites without meaning to wound. Children learn to see each other as threats rather than allies. The coat may be a promotion, an inheritance, a word of praise, a moment of recognition. The pit may be a conversation that excludes, a decision that ignores, a pattern that marginalizes. The silver may be social media attention, professional advancement, or simply the satisfaction of seeing someone else diminished. But the pattern remains constant. Envy leads to action. Action leads to consequence. Consequence demands either repetition or redemption. Here's what they never mention when they talk about forgiveness in greeting card slogans and social media posts. Forgiveness is not forgetting, because the brothers never forgot the pit and Joseph never forgot the sale. Forgiveness is not excusing, because Joseph clearly named their action as evil while simultaneously recognizing ability to weave evil into good. Forgiveness is not a feeling that arrives like weather, unpredictable and uncontrollable. Forgiveness is a decision that creates space for relationship despite injury, that chooses future over past, that refuses to let the worst moment define all moments. The implications cascade across centuries and continents. A family's dysfunction becomes a nation's foundation. A brother's betrayal becomes the mechanism of preservation. A pit in Canaan becomes a palace in Egypt, becomes a refuge for the hungry world. The coat that announced favoritism becomes the narrative that announces grace's ability to weave even betrayal into blessing. Joseph's dreams, which had seemed like arrogance, revealed themselves as prophecy. The brothers' bows, which had felt like humiliation, revealed themselves as fulfillment. The sail, which had appeared to be an ending, revealed itself as a beginning. Jacob's reunion with his lost son was a resurrection scene, played out in real time. The old man's journey to Egypt was a pilgrimage toward impossible hope made flesh. When he saw Joseph again, when he held the son he had buried in his heart, when he heard the voice that had been silent for 2 decades, something died and something was born in the same breath. The grief that had defined him dissolved into gratitude. The loss that had diminished him expanded into legacy. He lived long enough to bless Joseph's sons, to see his family multiply into the beginnings of a nation, to understand that his darkest chapter had become prologue to his brightest ending. The broader pattern emerges like a photograph developing in solution. God's purposes advance through human choices, both good and evil, both faithful and faithless. Providence does not eliminate agency, but encompasses it, does not override character but outlasts it, does not excuse sin but outmaneuvers it. The brothers' envy served God's plan without justifying their action, just as Judah's repentance served God's plan while validating his transformation. The same choice that led to sale in Canaan led to salvation in Egypt. Not because the choice changed, but because the chooser changed. Not because the action improved, but because the actor matured. This changed everything, and the phrase carries both warning and promise. For families fractured by favoritism, for siblings separated by jealousy, for parents whose love feels unequal and children whose worth feels conditional, the pattern offers both diagnosis and cure. The wound can become the door to healing, but only if truth precedes reconciliation, only if repentance accompanies restoration, only if the pattern that created injury also creates remedy. Judah's transformation from calculator to guarantor maps the journey from brokenness to wholeness. Joseph's rise from victim to victor illuminates the path from pit to palace. The question that emerges from the ancient dust settles on contemporary hearts. What pit are we digging today? What silver are we counting? What coat are we envying? And more hopefully, what truth are we avoiding that could become the key to freedom? What burden are we refusing that could become the bridge to healing? What forgiveness are we withholding that could become the foundation of restoration? The story lives because the choices live, because every generation faces the same fundamental decision between envy and empathy, between revenge and redemption, between the pit and the palace. You need to see this not as ancient history, but as present possibility. The brothers sold their sibling into slavery, but slavery became the door to salvation. The family's darkest hour became their finest legacy. The betrayal that should have ended everything became the beginning of everything. Therefore, the pit in your house can become the foundation of your palace. The silver that tempts can become the seed that saves. The coat that divides can become the banner that unites. But only if the pattern changes, only if Judah's later choice displaces his earlier calculation, only if Joseph's forgiveness outlasts his brother's offense. Stay with this, because what comes next in our series traces another thread through another house, another family whose secrets shaped nations, another moment when choice determined destiny. The faces change, but the stakes remain constant. Will envy or empathy write the next chapter? Will the pit or the palace define the ending? Right now, as we speak, someone is standing at the crossroads where this story began. The next step will echo across generations. Choose the palace. Choose the blessing. Choose to be the brother who says, "Let me be surety," rather than the brother who asks, "What do we gain?" This changed everything then. It can change everything now.